Well, hello and welcome to the Wine Access Unfiltered podcast. Many of you may know me on Instagram as some vivant, but what many of you might not know is why I strung those two words together in the first place. I'm sure some of you have gathered that, of course, this is a combo of sommelier, which is my profession, and bon vivant. But what some of you may not also know is what a bon vivant actually is, which is a lover of life, someone who enjoys food and wine and the pleasures of such. It occurred to me in sort of putting this podcast together, this particular episode, that we don't really talk about that enough. We break down wine and all of its complexities, but we don't often talk about what it means to enjoy wine, how to enjoy wine, and all of the pleasures that that can often bring. So I decided that as a little homage to my side of doing what I do on Instagram and the opportunity to sit down with my guest today, who documented his own journey to finding his inner bon vivant when he upped and moved his family from Minnesota to the south of France for 6 months. It was just sort of the perfect combination to do this episode. So please welcome to the show, writer, author, and tax preparer, Steve Hoffman.
Thank you. And yes, my tax preparation season just ended, so I'm feeling free as a bird. Yes, and now I get to drink wine in the morning, so it couldn't be better.
Congratulations on that. And yes, thank you we're literally 3 days after taxes were due on April 15th. So
honestly,
you're looking great. How much wine did you drink during that entire process?
A little, yes, I will. That was my reward at the end of the day, was my glass or two of wine on the couch with my wife. So that's our evening routine, is we sit, kind of play footsie on our couch and have a glass or two of wine, talk over the day. So yeah, wine is even integrated into my weird tax season.
I love that. Well, for those who haven't read or even listened to your book, because it is available in audio format, I've actually had the pleasure of reading and listening to it.
Oh, you did?
I did. And you do the narration of it, which is actually really wonderful to listen to because your French pronunciations are obviously perfect. And it's actually really nice to hear them out loud and hear the intonations with that. But the book, for those who are curious, is called A Season for That. This is lost and found in the other southern France, which you refer to, which is the Languedoc, which is actually the Languedoc-Roussillon, which is actually the very first wine region I ever visited as a professional. Yeah. And I had not a similar experience, but this idea of what it means to be a bon vivant and how that culture really embraces food and wine and weaves it all together really was what kickstarted this idea of wine isn't just in a vacuum, and food doesn't have to just be enjoyed independent of other things. Like, you can have this very holistic experience with all three. But you did a very unique thing, something that I think a lot of people aspire to do, which is upped and moved your family, and you guys spent 6 months there. You spoke French fluently, as you talked a lot about in the book. But what was that process like? And, we're in 2025 now. This, I think, took place in 2011.
12. Yep.
12?
Yep.
What, tell me about that. Take me back to that impetus, that start of that time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been a French speaker and a Francophone for most of my adult life. And as a result, we put our kids into French immersion school in St. Paul. So they had grown up with French as their primary language in school. And it involved a lot of driving. We were driving them across the city. And my wife and I at some point looked at each other. We'd love to travel. We both love, France and Europe in general, but hadn't spent a lot of time in Southern Europe. And we thought, okay, well, we're in Minnesota. It's a fall semester. Because of my tax preparation career, I have very intense early in the year work season where I get almost all of my work done and where I make most of the money that we make for our family for the year. So if I play my cards right, I can create some space in the second half of the year to not have to work. And that was the idea. Let's go to southern France and be warm instead of in Minnesota and be cold. Let's put our kids in local schools as a way of basically cementing this French language acquisition that they've been working on for 4 or 5 years. And then she and I think, didn't think it through very much, because the rest of it was, well, what do we do? And what we ended up doing was, in some sense, fighting because I got there and really had this, I think, immature notion of what it was going to be like, which is not immature as in, not emotionally immature, but more an underdeveloped idea of what this was going to be. We were going to get there. We spoke French, or I spoke French. The kids spoke French. We were going to get through somehow. It was going to be beautiful. We were going to be in southern France. Of course, it was going to be beautiful. And I was just going to have to. All I had to do was just kind of display my pretty French for the local villagers, and everything would fall into place. And of course, it didn't do that at all. But for the purposes of sort of this conversation and this wine, your sort of emphasis more on wine, through a lot of trials and tribulations, the sort of turning point of the book is I've reached this low point of feeling as if, I've been asked to make our family a part of this village, and I'm failing in every way that I try. And the harvest season, the vendange is just around the corner. And I finally essentially begged to be put onto a wine picking crew, a grape picking crew. And that is kind of the turning point between us being viewed, even though we were putting our kids in school, we were still very much viewed as outsiders. We were Americans. They had no particular, it's an 800-person village. It's like an extended family. They really didn't have any particular reason to reach out and gather us in as part of themselves. And we had to earn that. And so going out every day in the fields, working with these crews, and eventually getting invited into a winery in the village itself that was shared by two winemakers that we eventually became very, very close to, and have actually imported one of their wines into the Twin Cities area. That wine journey, for lack of a better word, from harvest to the end of our stay, suddenly took us from being these oddball outsiders who spoke French well, but who weren't making it happen, to being very much on the inside, not just of the village culture, but of kind of the winemaking world of that part of the country. And, it was a very, very deep education in a very, very concentrated, very short amount of time. But I left feeling very connected to wine, but wine at the production end of things, the rustic, unpretentious, agricultural, semi-industrial end of winemaking, not what happens, above a glass of wine when you swirl it, but very much, people with muddy boots and tractors, and knowing about the vines themselves as much as knowing about the grapes that they produce that eventually turned into the wine. And that part of wine and winemaking just really spoke to me. I've been a nature lover and a hunter and fisherman and a kind of forager outdoors guy for much of my life, or much of my adulthood. And that end of wine just really spoke to me, and I felt very, very hard for it.
What I thought was so beautiful was just the way that wine really brought you guys together, both as a community and as a family. One of my favorite scenes or passages in the book is the coq au vin, when you go into the shop and she reluctantly sells you the bottle of Cotonui, the Burgundy, and you come home, and it's this really beautiful scene where your two kids, had sort of been resisting this, very Provençal style of cooking. It was nothing like they had experienced at home. And then suddenly this dish, was on the table, and everything just sort of came together, both for you gastronomically, but also, as a family, emotionally. And I thought that deep connection it really stuck with me in that moment. Can we go back to that a little bit and break it down?
There's an initial scene in the book where Mary Jo basically says, it's early in the trip, and I'm not getting out of my comfort zone in a way that is going to end up in 6 months with us being a part of this place. And we both wanted to avoid this sort of shallow toe dip into this experience where we just kind of drop in, we do our thing, we leave, and kind of leave no trace. And so, early on, Mary Jo kind of says, hey, you need to step up. You need to get out of your comfort zone. This isn't working. And if this isn't going to work, and you're not going to put in any effort to integrate our family into France, well, then why are we here in France? We could be anywhere else in the world. And so my initial effort to try to accomplish that was to cook my way into the region. And as you know from having read the book, there are any number of comically bad cooking stories from early on. including a completely incinerated rabbit
Yes.
that ends up getting slightly torn to
The poor
shreds, and
rabbit.
that my daughter calls a chihuahua. So, but the kids are resisting, and so we decided, okay, let's try making a coq au vin. I've got a cookbook that I've been working through. It sounds fun. We don't really know what we're doing. We end up in the local larger city that's just adjacent to this village that we're living in. And by sheer chance, on a Sunday, which is often impossible in France, we find the market is open, and then just next door, a wine shop is open. And so we get our materials for the coq au vin. Eventually, we get our ingredients, and then we end up in the hands of this wonderful wine shop owner who just cares so deeply, and she's so earnest, and she wants this to be right for us. And she is terrified that she's suggesting a wine that's too expensive because she has a €4 bottle of wine to put into the coq au vin. And eventually she says, would you possibly be willing to consider this €8
Yes.
bottle of wine? We go home, we make the dish, and my daughter just sort of loses it at this dish, that she just didn't imagine that French food could do this to her. And then Mary Jo and I each have our first sip of pretty good Burgundy. We had tried, Burgundy sort of over the years, but this was good Burgundy. And we're like, oh, damn, well, now what do we do? Like, this just ruined our economic lives. But it was, as you said, the first, I think, experience of really good food and beautiful wine, or at least wine that goes with the beautiful food, all coming together at a moment where we're around the table as a family. And that became, I think, what we learned about how to be a family together for the rest of the trip.
As much as, I can appreciate that you said they take food so seriously, because they do, but it's also just so intrinsic for them. When I went to the south of France, it was just like, it felt so natural. Like, it was like, as you said in the book, like, of course we're going to break for lunch, of course, and not finish harvesting the rest of these rows. Of course, we're going to sit down for dinner.
Even when the rainstorms are coming, right?
Right.
You do not mess with lunch. Lunch happens.
Right.
And there's a rhythm to this. And if we miss a few rows because it rains this afternoon, that's already baked into the rhythm of life here. And
right.
And the other thing about it, especially now, I think this may be less true although I'm not even sure that's true. I want to say this may be less true in higher end sort of wine regions, right? Like a Champagne or a Bordeaux or a Burgundy. There is a preciousness and that you just can't argue with how much money is involved.
Yes.
But even there, I think the people who live there think of wine as a part of every day. They don't think of it. They don't think of themselves as a destination, and certainly in the Languedoc, they don't think of themselves as a destination. They know they're a wine place. They know people come to drink wine here, but it's so much about, wine can be so douchey. Can be so like English major. I'm better than you. I know more than you. I had this experience, and I'm, and you'll never have that. It can be really, unfortunately, douchey, and there is this sort of humbleness about wine in the places where it's made, where it's just it's just another agricultural crop, really, and it happens to enhance all the rest of it. But it's a beautiful relief to be there and not have to think about whether it's okay for me to love this wine or whether it's okay for me to serve this wine at the table. It's just integrated. It's unspoken and assumed that that's what's going to happen.
But I wonder, for people who maybe don't want to go to the south of France and have that in discovery, like, is it just going to your wine shop and going to your local grocer and trying to figure that out for yourself? Like, where would you recommend someone go or do?
I would say ultimately the answer that overarches everything is that it's about finding relationships. And so if that relationship is with somebody you trust at a local wine shop who will introduce you to the beauty and fun of trying different things and finding your way to a wine that you love that becomes a part of your daily routine or your life in some way, that's a great relationship. But it can also be that literally for one weekend you went to Napa, or for one weekend you went to Sonoma, or for a week you went to New Zealand or Australia, and you drank the wine there and you met the winemaker and you have an emotional connection to that wine. It so doesn't matter whether that is supposedly a great wine or not. It's so important that you have an emotional connection to the wine and its story. And I think you can create a story that connects you with a wine that is from the shelf of a wine shop in your city. There's nothing that's still a story. There's still something. You found it. You got introduced to it. It spoke to you for some reason. You had heard of the grape and wanted to try it, and suddenly it all blossomed in front of you when you had your first sip of that wine. But it can be any variation on that, and it's just the reassuring thing, I think, for people who aren't necessarily really deep in the sauce, really deep into the world of wine, and you can get infinitely deep. Like there's no bottom to the deep that you can get into the world of wine. But if you don't want to be that way, if you don't have the time or energy or willpower, but you still are interested in wine, there are always these relationships that you can establish. And the reassuring thing is that is actually how people who live in wine regions really relate to wine, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who live in places where wine is grown, they're not often collectors of wine. They're not often people who scan the world for the best vintage of this producer from this, from this slope in Burgundy. They're quite often people who mostly drink their own wine or wine made very near them, and they drink it because they've learned to love it. It's their sort of home team. It's made usually to go with the food that is also grown and served in that part of the world. The whole, if it grows together, it goes together cliche is still very, very true. Mm-hmm. And so if you just want to have a relationship with a particular wine and you love it for your reasons, you're actually doing it the way that people who make wine and who live in wine regions also do it. The collector and the connoisseur is the 1% oddball, really, in the world of wine when you think about how it's consumed and enjoyed for most people in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people think of wine drinkers as that 1%, the wine collector, the connoisseur that's got the crazy collection. But the reality is the majority of the drinkers are the ones that you talk a lot about in the book, the ones who just live and breathe wine, who, are out there farming during the day, or, who are even like you and I, you're tax preparing during the day. I'm doing God knows what in my garden when I'm not making wine videos. I do feel bad that we've gotten this far in the podcast and have not had a sip of wine together, which is completely my fault.
That's unacceptable. Yes.
So inappropriate of me. One thought I did have when you were just speaking was, if you want wine to be more a part of your life, I think when you're shopping for wine, and I always say this about the quality, but I think it also speaks in this instance, is look for a specific location on the bottle.
Yep.
Certainly there are great wines out there that, don't say that, or maybe you really resonate with the animal on the label, but specificity of place cannot be overestimated.
Right.
And I think this one is a great example of that. So the wine, if you are drinking with us and part of the wine club, this wine is from Corsica. This is our very first Corsican wine that we've included. This is Clove and Sherry. 2022 is the vintage. It's biodynamically farmed. The two grapes that are in here, I'm not going to butcher and try to pronounce. I'm just going to put them on the screen and let you have a go at it. Two grapes that are very much native to Corsica. I have not had a lot of Corsican wines in my life. The ones that I have had, I've quite liked.
Me too.
I think part of the reason that I haven't had a lot is they've traditionally been more expensive. Like I remember when Hermit Lynch first started importing Domaine Apatucci into the US, maybe actually probably right around when you were in the south of France, because I was living in New York. And you just don't see them that often. So when this came my way as a possibility, I definitely jumped at it, because there is this very like Mediterranean sensibility. They're described as, where France and Italy have a baby. I would maybe venture to say like where France and Sicily have a baby a little bit.
Yep.
But, they smell very vibrant and very fresh and very fruity in the way that you might expect from a warmer climate. But there's also something there that's kind of dark and brooding and spicy and a little
kind of
like
black fruit and spice and pepper.
Yeah. What's your background with Corsican wines? Have you had many?
No, in fact, I discovered them through Kermit Lynch, to be honest, and really love he imports two rosés from Corsica that I absolutely love.
I've had one of them. It's delicious.
Yeah, absolutely delicious. What I'm finding as I'm sipping this is a surprising. So normally in Mediterranean wine, because it's such a hot region, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, you tend to get a lot of sugar baked into the grapes because it's a long, hot growing season.
Mm-hmm.
And so the grapes get fully mature. And then quite often that leads to a lack of acidity because and what replaces the acidity is often alcohol. So the bite that you would get from like Loire Valley white wine, that green apple kind of acidic bite where your salivary glands start releasing, when you have a mouthful, that's replaced usually with higher alcohol, and then tannin would structure a southern wine as a rule, whereas acid will usually structure a northern wine. And what's interesting here is that Corsica is even farther south from where I was, and this is a remarkably acidic wine. It's light and acidic in both. It's light in color and body, and it's acidic, which is interesting and fun because sometimes if there's too much alcohol and not enough acid, it can get kind of viscous and flabby.
Yes.
And that's not happening here. This is beautiful. It's really, really light and approachable.
Yeah, it's grown at elevation. So this is at about 1,300 feet.
So that would partially explain it. So it'd be much cooler than, yep, sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
And I was just on a trip in the Pacific Northwest. I did a National Geographic cruise down the Columbia and Snake Rivers.
Oh my gosh.
And it was really fun. It was really fascinating. I think I'm going to talk about it more in another episode. But what was fascinating is, it was a food and wine sort of not sponsored thing, but food and wine partner with Nat Geo. And so it was a combination of drinking wine and going on hikes and boating. And so, you really felt the elements. But what was so fascinating, because I'm not somebody that often hikes, is, as I was, climbing this particular beacon rock and going up, to the top of the mountain, so to speak, I was like, this is a great way for people to understand why elevation matters so much when it comes to grape growing, because you're literally feeling it. Like on a day that we were there, you could feel the temperature start to shift as you moved up, but you also felt the intensity of the sun. And depending on which side, as we were kind of swirling around the mountain going up, you could really feel how that would change how a grape would ripen.
Yep.
And it was a great example of that. And I think this is really a wine. You feel the lightness of it. You feel that freshness, that acidity, but there's still this warm sort of like sun-kissed element. We're also kind of coastal, which is pulling this place down a little bit as well. I'm not totally sure where we're at in terms of of soil.
I think they said sandstone.
Sandstone. Oh yeah,
Yep.
Sandstone Hill.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, there's just so many things. I love that you talked about, the how close you are to the equator, which is so true. And then you throw in all these other elements, like, is it at elevation? How is it exposed to the sun? What kind of soil is it sitting on? What is the grape? Is it naturally predisposed to acidity, or is it a grape that really wants to increase in ripeness, which in turn is going to increase in alcohol? How much did you learn about grapes when you were harvesting? Because I loved sort of your breakdown of like Syrah and Mourvedre and Grenache, and sort of your explanations for each as you were discovering them.
Those grapes are such a part of life there that you get to know them almost like friends. They have personalities. They have character. They can be like moody,
Yeah.
So it's the five. The predominant grapes in the appellation that we were in, which is called Fougère, and it's a Languedoc appellation, very small but highly respected. It's about half of it is on the Mediterranean plain, and half of it is at elevation in the first foothills of what eventually becomes the Massif Central. The more you're in the field with these grapes, first of all, you get to know, because of the order of the season. You start with Cinsault, and then you move on to Syrah, and then you move on to Carignan, then you etc. And so they ripen in order because the season itself can shift up or forward or backward based on the climate that year or the weather that year. But the grapes themselves ripen in the same order every time. And so late ripening grapes can often be good Mediterranean grapes because they can handle that long Mediterranean summer. And so both in the field where you realize, like Syrah is easy to pick because it's small, long bunches. And there can be other grapes that are actually hard to pick, and you get kind of learn to hate them a little bit because the grape bunches tend to wrap around the vine branches. And you learn that I was there in more of a drought year, and so you learn that the Syrah that year was going to be tricky because there's small berries, and if there's not enough liquid from rain, it's a very high proportion of skin to juice, and you get these highly alcoholic, very, very tannic wines. And then in that kind of year, then you would love to have like a Cinsault or a Carignan to balance that out. The Cinsault because it tends to be a big, juicy, sort of floral, approachable grape. The Carignan because it was grown, you know, it's indigenous to the region. It will maintain its structure, but still, you know, be able to balance with a certain fruitiness the very alcoholic Syrah from that year. And so you start talking about these grapes, like I said, as if you sort of know them, and they do definitely have personalities, both in the field, on the vine, under the soil, and then also in the glass eventually. And the other way that you get to know them is, and this is one of the things that we did while we were there that I describe in the book, is at some point in the year after, usually the year after they're harvested, at least for the red wines, you go in and you do what's called the assemblage, which is the blending of these wines that have come from all these different parts of your domain, that have been treated in different ways, that have been made in oak or not, that have been traditionally fermented or done with carbonic maceration, that have been left on the lees for longer, they've done the pigeage or haven't done the pigeage. And that, again, there are 5 different grapes treated in many different ways. And, you know, you've got this incredible variety of options, and each of those grapes is going to add its little bit of personality to the final blend. And that was just an utterly fascinating experience to be in that laboratory and watch that process happen.
I loved listening to the blend when you guys were blending, because you had all of the revelations that I had when I first sat in a blending session, which is like kind of like, how hard could it be? Or it's kind of great. Like you taste these components and you're like, no, 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 this is like great as is. Like, don't do too much to it.
Absolutely.
And then you start seeing, you see the Mourvedre that's done in all these different ways, whether it's new French oak or single use French oak, or if it was done with some carbonic maceration. You see how these variables can play, and then how they can play with each other. And it is a fascinating process to see. It really opens your eyes to, all the different variables that can exist within winemaking. And I love that you really chronicled all of them. I think it's one thing that living in Napa Valley for as long as I did really helped me to understand wine in the way that you so eloquently put in the book, which is through all the seasons, and through all the different parts of the season, ranging from harvest all the way through blending. So it was really fascinating to listen to that. Did you have a particular like standout moment where like something really clicked for you in that season?
The one kind of magical moment that I also describe in the book is an afternoon where I'm just working, just kind of doing kind of menial work around the winery, and one of the 2 winemakers that we become friends with, Andre Balicioni, is there, and we're he's hosing something out, and it's it's very much a factory floor kind of setting, and then suddenly he says, you know what, we need to do something, and so we go into his cask room, basically his chai, and he basically has me taste 2 wines that have been aged, one in new oak and one in oak that had been used several times. It's the same wine from the same parcel, exact same grapes, exact same conditions, fermented the same way. And as I had been standing there filling this oak cask before we went into the room together, I'd been standing, and my job that day was to basically top off a bunch of oak casks. Mm-hmm. And the moment for me was leaning over that wooden cask with air and the char on the inside of the barrel and the spicy oak wood scent, plus that sort of dark fruit. I believe it was a Mourvedre that day, that dark, black fruited juice, all swirling around and kind of breathing out the top of that barrel, was something that it was an impression that I never have been able to shed. Like, that's always there. When I have a sip of red wine, much of the time that experience is there because I had those elements were so distinct and we're just starting to blend. Yeah. And in a finished glass of wine, they're all together and they can be intertwined in a way where it's hard to pick them out. Like, what is the char from the oak? What is the spiciness of the oak? What is the spiciness of the Syrah itself? Like, and there it was just a brief moment where I identify all of them at the same time, and knew that they were all going to contribute later, but I was getting them in their raw state. And then we went into the barrel room, and he basically had me taste, this one that was going to go. That was a new oak that was very sort of wild and untamed and very tannic and almost unpleasant to drink. But that over years in a bottle was going to smooth out and become. It had huge structure and lots of tannin, and that was going to make his very best wine. And then there was this other barrel where it was very drinkable right at the time. It was only a few years old. It was still in the bottle or still in the barrel. And I was like, oh, I actually prefer this easier one. And he was like, no, well, yeah, that one's fine. But this one over here, this is going to make a great bottle of wine.
Well, I love that. You are now, so this was 2012. When it took you a little while for the book to come out. I think you even acknowledged that in your opening acknowledgments.
Yep. It took 10 years.
10 years. And so
it took 10 years to write. Yeah.
Okay. And this was based on, Mary Jo was writing the blog. Did you have intentions of writing something out of this?
No, I had been a French, ancient Greek, English major in college. And
as one does.
And inevitably that led to a career in real estate and tax preparation, because nobody wants to hire a French, English, Greek major for anything.
Impressive as it may be,
except in academia, which I would have had to slip my wrist to go into academia. So what happened was I kept a journal while we were there, and I had kept travel journals before, but this one was much more intensive. And I was just so into this experience and so wanted not to forget it that I started writing almost every day, and that turned into eventually the base of the manuscript that would become the book. But it was early on. It was a much more sort of lighthearted kind of Peter Mayle style kind of romp in southern France. It was it's funny, and I think the book is funny. There are some very funny moments in the book itself, and I wanted it to be funny. I didn't want it to be earnest and sort of sweetsy, but the original manuscript was really taken from that journal, and it was kind of lighthearted and a little bit shallow, I guess I would say. It was a travelogue, but it wasn't a memoir. And what took those 10 years were, I think, two things. One was it took me that long. I knew when we left that something important and sort of a little bit life-changing had happened while we were there, but I felt like I didn't want to be premature in writing a book, publishing a book about it. I wanted to do the experience justice, and it took me that much time, I think, really to just digest what we'd been through and what it had done to me. And then the other reason it took 10 years is just simply I was a good natural writer of 1,000 to 2,000 word pieces for magazines and newspapers. And that food writing career also came out of this experience. I had never published anything about food before France in 2012. I submitted 3 of my journal pieces as articles to the Star Tribune while we were there. Those ended up winning a National Food Writing Award the next year. And that was just something that came naturally to me. But writing a book length, long form manuscript with intertwining storylines that has to be sustained over 300 pages, I just didn't have the skills. I kidded myself that I had the skills, but I didn't have the skills. And it took me 10 years to finally acquire them in a way that I could write a book that I could feel proud about.
And did your family feel okay about this, this experience being public?
As you know, Mary Jo, I'm the narrator of the book, but Mary Jo is the hero of the book. And in part by pushing me out of my comfort zone in a loving but firm way.
Yes.
And so actually when we got back home and I was going to go to New York for the ceremony for the book writing award, for the food writing awards, she's like, well, if you're going to go to New York, you need a book proposal. So she suggested it. And then for 10 years regretted having suggested it because I took her so seriously and I'm such a perfectionist that I refused to let it go. I wouldn't do it at anything less than my own standards, but I didn't have the skills to do it. And publishing is a difficult world to get into. And I had no background. I wasn't an MFA. I hadn't published much, if anything, before. And so Mary Jo she was done at several points with me writing this goddamn book. And the kids, I think I would say the kids, it just sort of, I was working, and whether I was working doing tax preparation for one part of the year. I was working on my book on the other part of the year. It was just that Dad was working. So I don't think, I mean, there are some regrets looking back that I spent so much time on it and that I missed some parts of the kids' lives. But we're also we're a very close family, and we spend a lot of time together. And we don't have a TV. We really focus on being together as a family when we're there. And so, yes, in theory, I could have spent more time with the kids, but I also feel as if, in retrospect, doing a big creative project like that and seeing it through is a way of kind of living the example rather than trying to teach kids by telling them what you should do.
I totally agree.
I don't mind having served as that example, even if, and they saw that it took a lot out of me, and it took a lot of perseverance, and it took some getting over myself and finding humility in some failures. And then at the end, there's this wonderful thing. And similar with Mary Jo and her photography project, her still blog project, that was a 10-year process. And she did it every single day. And yeah, in theory, some of that time could have been spent being mom and dad. But I also feel like, I really believe that this has nothing to do with wine, but I really do believe that, nothing that you tell your kids ever matters in terms of how their character develops. It's all what you do. It's all the example and the modeling that you present to them in how you live your life. And I'm not that upset about having lived that as an example of how to consider living one part of your life.
I couldn't agree more. I am not a parent. I am a child of two parents who worked very, very hard, and that was the example that I used and I continue to use as I have my own career path. And were they around all the time? No, absolutely not. But they tried to be, while also still maintaining their own career paths. And I think that's so important. I think showing versus telling is truly the way to go, not only with career, but also with what you're doing in terms of how do you want to live your life? Going to the south of France, having everyone sit down for dinner, enjoy opening a bottle of wine. I assume the kids are now getting close to, if not of age, to be able to drink wine with you guys, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Eva's 26 now, living in San Francisco, and Joe's 21 at NYU in New York. And they both love to sit with a glass of wine. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So what does that look like when they come home? What do you cook? What do you open?
My emphasis tends to be French, sort of French country or French Mediterranean, which not everybody, even now, still always loves. I always love it, but not everybody in my family always loves it.
Yeah.
Eva, as I describe in the book, really wishes that I had taken Italian in college so that we could go live in Italy, because she loves pasta and pizza, and not in a shallow way, but she really loves it. Like it speaks to her. Like Italian food really speaks to her. So when she's home, she'll make like Marcella Hazan's, simple bean dish with onions in a broth, and it's wonderful. And my Joe, as you know from reading the book, is this kind of intellectually curious deep diver. And in the book, he's into insects in the natural world and bugs and praying mantises and frogs. And now he's into he loves cooking, and he's fascinated with fermentation right now. So we're doing a lot of like lacto fermenting of vegetables, but also like creating our own liqueurs and cordials. And so he got really into Creole and Cajun cuisine. So he'll make red beans and rice, or dirty rice with andouille sausage, and then we'll all sit down and have dinner together. But it's great. The point is that they're interested enough in food to cook, and that they're cooking in the spirit of inquiry and curiosity and adventure. And so I'm the fact that they don't make me anchovy toast, I can live with, because they're doing it their way, which was always the point, right? Dad's going to do it his way. And what you're hopefully teaching is the spirit of how you engage with your life.
Do you think they would be that way or be inclined to do that without the experience that you guys had?
I would say much less so. We were interested in food and cooking before this, but this changed a lot because it was so comprehensive. In part because they went to school, and so it wasn't just mom and dad forcing them to eat weird food every night. Like, they were in school, there was an hour and a half for lunch every day, And those school lunches in France
Can't
were
even
really
imagine.
challenging. They had, pan fried fish, and they would have literally like mutton stew, and they would
Right.
have lentils and, all kinds of fruit. And they would have a different cheese every day as a way of like learning about the cheeses of France as part of eating their lunch. And, lunch was an integral part of the education process. And you were learning about what it meant to be French by eating well during the lunch hour. And what that also did then is taught the kids, well, all my friends are eating this, and so it's not weird. And they tried some things that they never would have tried if I had put it on a plate in front of them and said, eat this, right? So yeah, I don't think it would be anything. I don't think food and wine would be anything like as integrated as it is in our lives now if we hadn't had that experience together, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of the questions I had for you, because I'm sure a lot of people listening have kids and hope that their kids to some degree become more adventurous eaters, maybe more akin to what they're enjoying. I have a niece and a nephew who we definitely make a concerted effort to broaden their palates. They're both caviar lovers at the ages of 2 and 4, which people can have their own opinions about.
Yes.
But Mary Jo a lot in the book, says don't be a bully, don't force it.
Right.
Do you think outside of going to the south of France and integrating them that way, are there ways to get kids or just get people interested in exploring other cuisines? And sometimes I think it's wine, right? Sometimes people are like, oh, I don't like Syrah, or I don't like this, but then you pair it with the right dish and feelings change and people's opinions of things change. Do you have any suggestions or comments on that?
It's like what I say about hospitality. You have to love it, and if you love it, then I think it's just another way
like
of leading by example.
Passion.
Yeah, it's another way of leading by example. If you love it, they're going to find a way to love it eventually. Or even in, okay, you like a really, really smelly cheese, right? And they may never find their way, although it's surprising how much they can find their way, I think. But they may never find their way, but even that then becomes part of your relationship, where it's this sort of headbutting, Dad, I'm not going to eat that stupid cheese. And, oh yeah, I'm going to, it's still a part of that sort of banter then becomes part of your relationship. But I think you have to love food to teach somebody else to love food. And if you don't, it's going to be really hard, because you're teaching again. You're telling them that you're introducing shoulds into the conversation. And one of the rules of our family is that there are no shoulds. And because shoulds are, again, it's that I think I'm being a good parent because I'm telling my kid how life should be lived. I'm telling them what's right and wrong. And that just goes, I just know that goes in one ear and out the other. It doesn't stick because it doesn't feel like a relationship. And so, this isn't a great answer, but I think it is the answer that I believe in, which is if you love food and you revel in food and you spend enough time with food to prepare it in a way that's flavorful, and that at some point your kids are going to love that food too. Although here's other thing I would say. This is a very long answer to your short question. One other thing that happens in the book really is there is that turning point with the mother of the grocer in town, where I've been trying to, learn how to cook French, and I started off really, really complicated. And it's clearly at some point my cooking is about my own ego, right? It's about presenting somebody with something that looks really fancy. It looks like I put a lot into it. It looks like it took a lot of skill, but it's not necessarily flavorful, and it's often not what they would want to eat. And so there was also this turning point where I am in the grocery store with the grocer's mother, who's kind of been this mentor figure with me. She's taught me, how to make certain things. She's taught me how to make how to make my own vinegar. And I have this insight where she's telling me about this dish called the macaronade, which is a very indigenous to the southern coast of France, to the city of Sète. And I'm like, I don't want to hear about macaroni. Right. I'm here in France, right? This needs to be French food. But she talks about how her family loves it, and they regale themselves, is the expression she uses in French. And I have this insight. This is a serious French cook. This is somebody who's made dishes 2 or 3 times a day for 60 years for 4 generations of family. And the reason that she's making a macaronade is, yes, partly because it's local and has a reputation, but mostly because she loves her family and she loves to see them love her food. And there's a humility in that, even though she's very skilled. She's, she can make everything from scratch. She could be ego driven if she wanted to be, but really what really drives her is that her family regales itself around the table, that they love what she eats, and she gets to share her love for them by giving them food that they love. That, I think, that is also an element of this, and it's maybe a little bit different motivation for what I started with. But being aware of getting outside yourself and being aware of what your family would love, and then providing that to them, is a beautiful way of being engaged with food and of serving food.
I think it's a beautiful way of doing it. I think when you, not to be cliche, but when you cook with love and you make food with intention, and it's not necessarily an afterthought, I think that's when the paradigm shifts a little bit. And I've noticed that even at home, like, my family has always been very into food, but we look at it slightly different now. Now it's got a wider lens because there's more people, and there's more palates to please. But there's also a thoughtfulness behind it, and we all kind of like think of each other, and we look for recipes. And the other thing is, it doesn't have to be complicated. I think people think of wine and food as this very complicated, going back to what you had said before, this generational thing that requires a fancy tablecloth. And sure, those things do exist, but in my home, like, a block of cheese and a great piece of bread and a glass of wine, like, that constitutes a meal.
Absolutely.
And it's a really good one.
Absolutely.
And I think it's one to not, don't underestimate it, and don't underestimate just how soul fulfilling that can be. Everybody gets busy. We all have lots of things to do, but just having little things in your fridge, I think, can really elevate or change the mood of an entire day. Stopping at your local bakery to get a fresh loaf of bread can change the way that we have a day. Are there little things like that? Are there provisions that you have in your fridge or stops that you'll make along the way to do that?
We love cheese as a family, and Wisconsin gets a little bit mocked as the home of cheeseheads. But there are some Wisconsin cheeses that are among my favorite cheeses in the entire world, as somebody who loves French cheese. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing is, we like to have really good cheeses around, but it's fun to be letting, local cheesemakers show you that they can make cheese that is on a world class. But otherwise, yeah, I have my little larder with, my secret ingredients, and they include anchovies for sure. They include, I love to work with capers. Mm-hmm. I really love piment d'Espelette, which is the slightly spicy but not super spicy red pepper from the Pyrenees. I really love different kinds of really good salt, like the flaky salt to finish a dish with, sea salt from different places, and it can be fun to just have just like a slice of baguette dunked in really good olive oil with a sprinkling of salt. Like, that's so, and so it's, yes, it's just salt, but it's also a little bit elevated in a fun way. So those are the ones that come to mind right away. I also, obviously, I have lemons around all the time. I really like to have ginger around. And two other things that I've worked with more and more lately would be Aleppo pepper, which is another kind of mild cooking pepper, and then sumac, which is it's used a lot in sort of Levantine and Northern African cuisine, and it provides an acidity where if you don't have like citrus or something, and quite often like a sauce or a soup or something feels a little bit flat, and then a little bit of sumac gives it a little bit of acidity. So, yeah, I'm
yeah, no,
I could keep going, but yeah, those are the ones that I'm having most fun with right now.
They're great, and to your point, like, there's not much that a piece of bread, olive oil, and some salt doesn't go with on the wine front. Mm-hmm. So, like, there again, if there's you just want like a snack, or like if that's dinner, which, let's be honest, sometimes it is. If you were drinking this wine at home, is there something a dish you might prepare or a snack that you might like to have with it? I'm speaking of the Mexican wine, of course.
Great question. Honestly, I think like a duck breast, like like a magret or some kind of duck breast sautéed in its own fat, then sautéing like some diced or chopped potatoes in that same duck fat, with a sauce that either was a red wine sauce using a Mediterranean wine as the base of the sauce, or maybe something with like cherries or sour cherries in it to go over the duck. I feel like that would go with the red fruitiness here, but the meaty, almost steak-like bloodiness of the duck breast would go really well with the the kind of, there's some deep fruit in this.
Yeah.
But also there's enough acidity and tannin in here that would cut through the very fatty skin that normally comes with the duck breast. So my first thought would be duck with potatoes sauteed in duck fat.
Oh, yes. That sounds, I mean, you're welcome. I'm not like, I'm a plane right away. Come over. I'm ready for you. I'll have everything ready. I unfortunately have an electric stove, which is not the best to navigate.
We can work with that.
I love a good duck breast, but if I'm being realistic, that's not going to happen on a weeknight for me. But I've been really into these Madras lentils that are done with like tomato and curry. That they're like very easy to make, and just some like rotisserie chicken. So some like red lentils and rotisserie chicken. So again, like it can be this, this formal thing. And if you want to take the time to make a meal, by all means, I highly recommend doing it at least once a week. Just finding the time, and like that is my unwind period. Like, I'll go work out, but then I will find time to cook a meal, because it's the one time that I can't be on my phone. I can listen, I can turn music on, I can have a glass of wine while I'm doing it. And the meditation is real. It will turn your day around.
Absolutely. There's an important sort of breathing in and breathing out over the course of the day, and do it, periods of activity and periods of rest. And I really feel like cooking is one of those periods of rest, and a lot is happening psychically, emotionally, in terms of processing the day. All kinds of things are happening, even though you're really just stirring a skillet full of vegetables. I totally agree. I think it does more than just put food on the table.
Yeah. And you're creating something. You're watching this like sort of metamorphosis take place as well, right? When you brown something, and
especially as a writer, where I can do really good work over the course of the day and have nothing to show for it. That actually, honestly, is a really important thing with cooking. Is at least at the end of this, there's going to be something. It might not be any good, it might not get eaten, but there will be something to show for this effort after a day of pounding my head against my desk and not getting anywhere that I want to get when I started the day. The tangibility of the results is a really big deal for me too.
Yeah. When I was still a working som on the floor in Napa Valley, and I was creating videos, people used to say like, what's your dream? And I think everyone expected like, I want to get to $1 million. My dream was to create something new every day. My dream, and which, I could do at any point, but like to have the time and for that to be my full-time gig is like, if I can create something new, start to finish every single day, like that to me is the dream. And that can be, a feasible thing with cooking. I
absolutely
agree completely.
Absolutely.
Finishing a dish.
Sure.
The $1 million question is, it's been a while since this journey happened. Have you gone back to the south of France?
We did. We actually went back to the same village and lived in the same house 3 more times after 2012. So we went 2014, 2016, and then 2019 and 2020.
Okay.
The kids went back to the local schools. They moved their way through the local schools. Joe started in elementary school, went to middle school. Eventually in 2019, he went to a high school in Béziers nearby, took the bus in the morning and hung out with his buddies at cafes and probably snuck some vodka and cigarettes. At that point, Eva was in college, so she wasn't with us for that last trip. But then, unfortunately, the last trip, 2019 into January 2020, I had to come back for my tax season in 2020. We came home to COVID. Right. We all sheltered in place together, which was kind of weirdly wonderful. It was kind of a magical time, even though it was a horrible time. But for our family, we were all together, Eva with her boyfriend, Joe with his girlfriend. Like we were all together in the same house for a whole year after we thought we kind of set the kids off on their journeys. And it was cool. We got to know the boyfriend and girlfriend well and kind of fall in love with them and kind of already consider them part of the family if they ever do become a part of the family. So we came back to COVID, and then Joe started at NYU, which is eating all of our travel budget for and will for another about year and a half. So I've not been back in a significant way. I've taken little kind of surgical strikes to write a couple articles and to visit some people, but we haven't been since 2020, and I'm really itching. I feel as if being there is a way of expressing a part of myself when I'm operating at my best. If there's the challenge of operating in a foreign language, there's how different it is from life here and how congenial it is to how I think about how life should be lived. I love being a Minnesotan. We love it here. It's a beautiful state. I love the cold. Actually, it's very, very. There's tons of woods and forests and lakes and rivers. I really love it here, but there's a part of me that's never fully fulfilled here, and that fulfillment comes from living in some way or another in France, operating at like I said, at kind of at my peak performance. And I really miss that. I miss that just daily sense of adventure from being somewhere that's not home, that's not my native country.
Well, that's what the wine's for. It takes you back when you can't physically be there.
It does. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, literally there's a connection because we're still close to those two winemakers. And that's in part why I would go back, is to visit them and sit around a table and drink their wine with them.
Yeah.
There is that really very emotional friendship connection every time I open one of their bottles of wine. So many memories are released, and so much emotion is released when you have what we talked about early in this conversation, an emotional relationship with the wine, the reason that you love it, or reason that you connect with it. Every time you open that, you get to re-experience that connection.
Well, it's a beautiful book. It's was really a pleasure to both read and to listen to. If we can have everyone just go buy a copy so we can help refill the coffers so that you can get back to
that would be great. I would
appreciate
that. I would appreciate that. Yes, yeah.
The book is called A Season for That. I have it here in front of me. You can see it.
Thank you.
Anything else that's happening in your world that people should know about?
Well, I hope I'm working on a second book. I don't know what it will be. I'm also hoping to do some writing for Food and Wine magazine coming up in some really fun topics. And then otherwise, no, I'm really active on Instagram. That's probably the place you can find me the most easily. It's just at SJR Hoffman, Stephen John Raymond Hoffman. And my website has a lot of my other published work. If you like the book or are curious, I've written a lot about both sort of northern Great Lakes bioregion food and French and Southern French food and wine. And so that the website is just www.sjrhoffman.com. And, I'm very findable online. I love to get inquiries. I love to answer questions. So anybody who's curious or just has a question or just wants to check in and connect, don't ever hesitate to just send me an email.
Well, we will certainly link everything below. It's been one of my favorite reads of the last decade. It is a wonderful way to learn about wine and immerse yourself in a culture that we don't often get to immerse ourselves in. And just, I think the winemaking process, the way that you take us through harvest and all the way through blending is a really great lens into a world, again, that we don't often get to see. And I think you describe it so beautifully, and it's easy to enjoy, and it's just a really lovely read, especially as we're heading into summer months and pining for warmer weather. So thank you so much for taking the time. I'm going to let you go into the weekend that I'm sure you've been very much looking forward to post-tax season.
I appreciate that.
I look forward to your next work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a joy.
Cheers.
Cheers.